Hello everybody, this is Dr. Oren. I hope you're doing well. Day 46 since YB shut down. And yes, as the meme says, keep calm. Only 16 days left for what? The AP exam, as you know. So let's take another look and review. The exam will be Wednesday, May 13 at 11 a.m. Pacific time. And you'll need to have everything set up about half an hour before, 15 minutes at the very latest. Make sure your connection is secure and you're all ready to go. We'll be talking more about the nuts and bolts, the mechanics of the exam as we go, but at this point you should have been working your way through the YouTube videos on the AP Lit channel, YouTube channel, and at the very least starting with videos 7 and 8, and then skipping forward a little bit to the video on Middlemarch, the Middlemarch essay, and you should have watched that video. You should have watched my previous video lecture on the Middlemarch essay to prepare yourself and done the essay, written the essay. At this point, I think you should be fast forwarding, skipping even farther up, and starting with video 18 on the YouTube channel. Right now they're heating up and getting into gear for the essay, so the lessons right now are focusing on writing, working your way through the essays, writing each of the components of the essay and putting it all together. This is what we'll be working on as well. In the previous video lecture, we looked at a prompt and passage from a 19th century Victorian novel by George Eliot called Middlemarch, and we worked our way through that passage through to an essay, and hopefully you've all have done the essay. Today we will look at a prompt which deals with a passage from a 20th century novel by Louise Erdrich called The Beet Queen. It's a work I've never heard of or read, let alone read, but we're going to dive in and see what we can do. Here's the prompt from the 2015 exam, question 2 exam, and the point here is to look at text passages from different periods. So last time, again, we looked at a 19th century novel, an older piece of writing, and the prompt this year could very well come from that period. But we also should be prepared for a more modern novel, a 20th century novel. So let's take a look at the prompt. And as you can see, there's no permission to reproduce the excerpt. We'll have to look at that separately. But let's just dive in and read the prompt. Question 2. Here it says suggested time 40 minutes. Remember, you'll have 45 minutes to write the essay and then 5 minutes to upload the essay online. The following excerpt is from the opening of The Beet Queen, a 1986 novel by Louise Erdrich. Read the passage carefully, then write a well-developed essay in which you analyze how Erdrich depicts the impact of the environment on the two children. You may wish to consider such literary devices as tone, imagery, selection of detail, and point of view. On second thought, let's just review a few key phrases from this prompt. Write a well-developed essay in which you analyze how Erdrich depicts the impact of the environment on the two children. You may wish to consider such literary devices as tone, imagery, selection of detail, and point of view. So recall the impact of the environment on the two children. How is Erdrich depicting that? And here's the passage. You can see there are 6 paragraphs. The first paragraph is just a single sentence, but let's zoom in and read this together. So that's how I came to Argus. I was the girl in the stiff coat. After I ran blind and came to a halt, shocked not to find Carl behind me, I looked up to watch for him and heard the train whistle long and shrill. That was when I realized Carl had probably jumped back on the same boxcar and was now hunched in straw, watching out of the open door. The only difference would be the fragrant stick blooming in his hand. I saw the train pulled like a string of black beads over the horizon, as I have seen it so many times since. When it was out of sight, I stared down at my feet. I was afraid. It was not that with Carl gone I had no one to protect me, but just the opposite. With no one to protect and look out for, I was weak. Carl was taller than me, but spindly, older of course, but fearful. He suffered from fevers that kept him in a stuporous dream state, and was sensitive to loud sounds, harsh lights. My mother called him delicate, but I was the opposite. I was the one who begged spotted apples from the grocery store and stole away from the back stoop of the creamery in Minneapolis, where we were living the winter after my father died. This story starts then, because before that, and without the year 1929, our family would probably have gone on living comfortably in a lonely and isolated white house on the edge of Prairie Lake. We rarely saw anyone else. There were just us three, Carl and me and our mother, Adelaide. There was something different about us even then. Our only visitor was Mr. Ober, a tall man with a carefully trimmed black beard. He owned a whole county of Minnesota wheatland. 2 or 3 times a week he appeared, in the late evenings, and parked his automobile in the barn. Carl hated Mr. Ober's visits, but I looked forward to each one because my mother always brightened. It was like a change of weather in our house. I remembered that on the last night Mr. Ober came to visit, she put on the blue silk dress and the necklace of sparkling stones that we knew had come from him. She wound and pinned her dark red braid into a crown and then brushed my hair 100 light, even strokes. I closed my eyes and listened to the numbers. "You didn't get this from me," she said at last, letting the hair fall limp and black about my shoulders. When Mr. Ober arrived, we sat with him in the parlor. Carl posed on the horsehair sofa and pretended a fascination with the red diamonds woven into the carpet. As usual, I was the one whom Mr. Ober singled out for petting. He put me on his lap, called me Schatze. "For your hair, little miss," he said, pulling a green satin ribbon from his vest pocket. His voice was deep-pitched, but I liked the sound of it in counterpoint to or covering my mother's. Later, after Carl and I were sent to bed, I stayed awake and listened to the grown-ups' voices rise and tangle, then fall, first in the downstairs parlor and then, muffled, in the dining room. I heard both of them walk up the stairs. The big door closed at the end of the hall. I kept my eyes open. There was darkness, the creaks and thumps that a house makes at night, wind in the branches, tapping. By morning, he was gone. Okay, let's take a look at some of my annotations. Again, there's no way you're going to have time on the exam to make this many annotations, and in fact, because it's going to be online, you're not going to be able to mark up the page unless you printed it out, which probably is unrealistic and would be too time consuming anyway. But I want to give you the annotations in order to show what is possible, what kinds of connections you might be making, and of course you will make your own as well. But you can see how I have, as I've gone, circled things that I think are important right off the bat. I notice that we have a first-person point of view, that the narrator is recounting a memory from the past. Now, right off the bat, I didn't, though as well, it's not clear what this initial phrase, "so that's how I came to Argus," is referring to. So I'm just going to bracket that, put a question mark there. More details about the narrator, the girl, stiff coat, was, though. This is, though the narrator isn't a girl now, you presume that she's just remembering, recounting a time when she was a girl. You can see things that I've noticed, features. I've noticed a simile here of the string of black, like a string of black beads. I have circled words that even though I say tone, it's not exactly tone, but it connects to the kinds of emotions that are behind the passage. And I've annotated crucial information, for example, the point that she was weak, but not for the reasons you might think. It's because she needs to protect someone, look out for someone. Of course, I've circled the death of the father and identified it as a loss or a death that no doubt will be formative for the entire passage. I've circled the year 1929 in this passage, which I can connect to the Great Depression. And notice that this particular paragraph is about a counterfactual, about what would have been had something not happened, had the year 1929 not happened. Other features I've noticed this further simile down here where the mother brightens and the whole place changes like the weather, and a further image of the necklace of sparkling stones. Then, if you notice, I've connected repeating words or repeating images, and so I see the word opposite here, and I see the word opposite down here. I also notice the shift from eyes are closed my eyes, to I kept my eyes open. But that reminds me of the very beginning of the passage, or near the very beginning, where the phrase "after I ran blind." And by the way, the word Argus is supposedly, I guess that's a town, but Argus I recognize as an allusion to a Greek mythological creature having lots and lots of eyes, maybe 100 or 1,000 eyes, but that won't really come into my analysis at all. I've noticed that this this little counterfactual paragraph talks about the plot. In other words, this is the beginning of the story. The story begins with tragedy, with a kind of loss. And finally, I've noticed the final word "gone," and I noticed that that matches to an earlier word where Carl is gone. And then that makes me, though, think of another occurrence in the middle here that it's gone, but the phrase is "gone on" rather than "gone." Again, there's no way you will make this many annotations, but as you're reading the passage, I would recommend either having a piece of paper to jot things down, or just an open document to take some notes on, just writing down a few key words and phrases that you can then group into some kind of order or organization under features, that literary features, tactics that you're noticing, patterns, repetitions, contrasts, and so on. We will get further into this, but you should be doing just a little bit of this. Not all of it, but you should have some notation that you're doing that's going to help you to organize the essay. And again, I think it's going to have to be a piece of paper that you have on your desk, or you have an open doc that you're just noticing the words and typing them out in really quick phrases to help you organize your reading. Right now, we have the luxury of really poring over the text and taking it all in. Obviously, when you're taking the exam, you don't have that luxury. So it's a much more compressed process, and you just can't do all of this. But I do want to again show you what is possible. What are some things you might be noticing? So one more time, I want to return to the prompt just to refresh our memories, keep it in our heads what we're trying to do here. So analyzing how Erdrich depicts the impact of the environment on the two children. So if you notice, the impact of the environment on the two children is the topic, although it's actually even a little bit more specific. It's how is that being depicted. So there's an impact of the environment on the two children, So it's not even, it's an assumption. You're not even being asked to argue that pro and con. Is there an impact of the environment on the children? They're telling you there is. The question is, how is Erdrich depicting it? Again, could be pro, could be con. You may wish to consider, so such literary devices, they're giving you a list of features, of devices, of tactics that you can map onto the larger strategy. Now, of course, you don't have to go with these devices, but they are prompting you, they're pointing you in probably the right direction. Tone, imagery, selection of detail, and point of view. So look how I've broken down the prompt. Obviously, the imperative is to analyze. You're trying to do analysis here. You have to go beyond the obvious, but you need to bring in evidence and support, use the evidence to support your assertion or claim. The other thing, though, is again, it's how is it being depicted? How is this topic, the impact of the environment, how is that being portrayed, depicted? So you run into that word often in the prompt. I don't know whether it will be there this time or not, but depicts, portrays. Think about how someone might represent you or something visually. Is this a portrait that puts it in a good light, puts it in a bad light? Is it neutral? That's what you need to think about. How is the text prompting you to think about this topic? What position is it prompting you to take on the impact of the environment? So that's a given here. You're not being asked to weigh in whether or not the environment has an impact on the children. It's assumed. So the question is how is that impact getting depicted? Now, again, you don't have to reduce everything to a positive or sort of pro or con, but that's one way to start, and then go out from there and make it more complicated. So right now, jot down your overall impression of how the environment has impacted the two children in the passage. Was it good or bad? Was it pro or con, the environment? You can start from there again, and then make it more complicated if you see it that way. So let's take a look at the suggested devices. These are the devices the prompt points us to. Tone. Tone is a literary speaker's attitude to his listener. So the speaker or the narrator is projecting, is conveying a particular attitude in the style and the way that it's written. Is it a critical or approving attitude, critical or approving tone? Is it a formal or an intimate tone? Is it outspoken or is it reserved? And so on. You can see the endless kinds of tones, attitudes that a speaker or narrator might take through the way that they are writing, the form, the style. And you have to identify that and then try to understand how is that contributing to the portrait, to the way that the text is encouraging you or leading you or prompting you or provoking you to view that topic. Imagery, concrete language, anything can also be figurative language, but again, the quick and dirty way to understand imagery is anything that you can feel by the five senses, and usually imagery is expressed through some kind of concrete language. Selection of detail, that is description of particulars, of small minutiae. Point of view as the way that the story is getting told. So the way, the mode, the means by which the author is presenting the reader with various parts of the narrative of the story. So we can think about point of view as also just being the narration, the narrator, first person, second person, and so on, but it can open up into more complex considerations. Now, those are the ones that they point you to, the prompt points you to. I'm going to add a few more. Let's go through them. Contrasts or binary oppositions. And this is something we've been talking about all year, but again, I've been casting it in terms of binary oppositions. Of course, you can expand it even more to consider contrasts. And so we could say that, in a way, though, contrast oppositions, all thinking comes down to that, putting things together that are alike uh, and pointing to differences, looking at two things and pointing out similarities and differences, contrasts, similarities, plot, what happens in the narrative, and in what order and action the events and actions are told. Structural irony, where some structural feature serves to give readers an opposite interpretation from the one a character makes of events. For example, a naive hero or narrator or spokesman who puts an interpretation on affairs that calls on a knowing reader to alter or correct that view. So you might recall verbal irony is when the speaker means the opposite of what they're saying. Structural irony is when there's some feature, some structural feature that leads a reader to come to an opposite understanding of that which is expressed somewhere in the text structurally, either through a character, the naive hero, and so on. So let's apply these features, these devices, to the text and try to come up with a list of observations and of sort of proto-analyses that we can build on. The one thing that strikes me about the tone is, as I was pointing out before, I was noticing a lot of emotions, but on the other hand, I think the tone, even though there are, it might be a sad one, or including events that have to do with loss, separation, and trauma, the style is matter of fact. The speaker makes just statements of fact. But of course, the events and the details of the narrative contribute to a sad, lonely tone, even the kind of words that the narrator uses. Of course, 1929 brings up the connection to the Great Depression, which is an economic period, but obviously has emotional resonances as well. And then finally, last but not least, the death of the father, which are all again shaping events on the children and relate to the question, the topic of the prompt, which is to do with how the environment is impacting the children. What kind of imagery do we see in the passage? The train whistle, the train like a string of black beads, which suggest that the train is getting smaller, so it's then compared to this string of black beads. Change of weather, the reflecting the mother's emotions, the necklace of sparkling stones, the image, this gift, this object that Ober gives to the mother. And I've noticed that there is some strange connection between the necklace of sparkling stones and the string of black beads. I want to draw those two images into conversation with one another because I think the text is asking us to think about them together. Selection of detail. Now, there are so many things that you could point out here, but just from the first and second paragraphs, some of the phrases that seem to do with detail: stiff coat, Carl being hunched in straw, this fragrant stick blooming, Carl being sensitive to harsh lights, loud sounds, the begging of spotted apples, stealing away from the black stoop. That's a mistake. It should be W-H-E-Y. But you could notice so many details here, and I actually don't do very much with most of these. Point of view, we've already discussed first person point of view. The narrator is telling a story, so she's remembering past events from when she was a girl. But she's writing from an older vantage point. She gets separated from Carl, And so there's a kind of flash, but there's also a flashback to 1929. This is maybe getting into plot a little bit, but plot is related to point of view here because the narrator is jumping back to these particular episodes. Now let's take a look at all the contrasts and binary oppositions in this piece. And I have a preliminary set, and then I want to explore more. There's, again, no way that you can cover all of these and map these out in this way. However, you can notice a few. You can notice a couple, or you maybe notice all of them, but you want to selectively look at a couple to use them to think through your argument. And so let's go through this range of oppositions I notice. Just to remind you about oppositions, you can think about oppositions as these two terms that are in some relationship. It's up to you to provide the logic of that relationship. What's the larger point that these two terms might be gesturing toward or making? So for example, you could think that one term might be considered better than the other, or in some way more favored by the narrator, by the text than the other. And you can work through terms that are adjacent to each other. So for example, if you start with the narrator, but then you go to what are some of the qualities of the narrator, narrator being bold versus Carl being timid, then you can make that jump, you can make that logical connection by saying the narrator seems to be in a better position than Carl for these characteristics, and the text is somehow endorsing those characteristics. Now you could also flip it on its back. You could say, well, it appears as if one column of terms is better, is superior, is somehow more favorable to the other column of terms. That's an argument in itself. Or you can argue that there's some third position, that the text is presenting us with these two terms. It seems as if one is more important, is better than the other, but then the text somehow breaks that down or asks you to think further and more deeply about just this binary opposition. So, and there are a couple of ironies. The sister is younger than the brother, but it's the older brother who needs protection, and the sister needs to protect. So it's a paradox that she's weak if she can't protect others. She's also the opposite of delicate. We never find out exactly what that word is, maybe tough. And they both have different views about Mr. Ober's visits. Carl is sort of retreating into himself, is almost afraid to face the world. But the narrator is jumping out of the box car. She's bold, willing to do what is necessary, begging and stealing just to survive. Some bigger oppositions or more to carry this further. I'm not sure it's totally bigger, but I do think that it opens up. There's 1929, and then before or without 1929, the counterfactual. And I'm on the side, that things that come with 1929, loss of the father, the Great Depression, other oppositions that don't exactly map onto the previous ones, but in a way they do. Poor on the one side, comfortable. Right? If they didn't have 1929, they would have had a comfortable life. The father is the dead father opposed to the figure of Mr. Ober, the rich Mr. Ober. Mother's voice, Mr. Ober's voice, eyes closed when the mother's counting, eyes open even though they're in darkness. But then the word that she's running blind, she ran blind, versus seeing. So there's a larger motif of sight in this passage that suggests a number of things, but a shift from not seeing to seeing. And what does that stand for? The stuporous dream state that Carl's in versus the awake narrator. Once again, once you notice the binaries, once you notice these contrasts, the question you have to ask is, what's the logic here? What's the argument? What's the analysis? So that's the formula. You notice, you recognize contrasts, and you start to think, What is the logic? And you can just reduce it down. You can think, is it pro or con? What's the relationship? Do they need each other? Does it only appear as if one is over the other one, superior to the other one, and it turns out not to be the case? Uh, what's the logic? And then explain how that's the case. Explain how that binary opposition is either supported, is either confirmed, or it somehow breaks down in something else. Maybe it flips, or maybe there's a third way. But it's in the explanation that you really secure your interpretation, and by drawing on evidence, give your reasoning and your analysis. A few things about plot. We have the story begins in 1929. It otherwise might not have even happened. The story might not even happened without the loss of 1929, the death of the father, the Great Depression. So if you're thinking about the sophistication points, you're thinking about historical context, you're thinking about larger social issues, social questions that the text might be commenting on, such as class or race or gender. So there's a strange shift that just I noticed. I'm not sure I can do anything with it in the essay, but something about her coming to Argus, then being separated from Carl on the train. When precisely that is, I don't think it's clear. But then this flashback to 1929, and then more specifically to Mr. Ober's last visit. On structural irony, I'm not sure that there's enough time in the essay, 45-minute essay, to dive this deep, but you can think about how the narrator does seem to move from eyes shut to eyes open, suggesting this coming to knowledge that kind of makes her tough, makes her going out to meet the world. But on the other hand, I would suggest that it's ironic because in the end, as a child, she doesn't entirely understand those creaks and thumps, what they signify, which is, I think clearly the mother and father having having a liaison, let's put it that way, and that this somehow drives home the sadness at the loss of the father, that Mr. Ober is not a new father for her, but only there to get something from the mother. Let's put this all together in a thesis, and I have two versions of this thesis, basic and advanced. The basic one, I think, is it's actually a little even more than basic, because I think I can get the thesis point in two different ways. In this passage from Louise Erdrich's novel The Beet Queen, Erdrich uses binary oppositions, imagery, and point of view. So those are the three techniques, those are the three devices, the tactics, but so far that's just observation. I haven't made a claim yet. Then I throw in order to. That sets up the claim. So Erdrich is using these features, these devices, tactics, in order to depict the lifelong scars and damage that the environment can inflict on children. So I've made the claim that those techniques, those devices, those tactics, that the novelist is using those tactics in order to support a particular position, in order to depict the topic in a certain way. In other words, the con position, that the environment damages, can scar children. And of course, in this case, it's the losing the father, growing up in poor circumstances. I think I get the thesis point in two ways. One is just claiming that the novelist is using these devices in order to do something, in order to support a particular position. Even if that position was obvious, then it was just a summary, just an observation, and I still think I would get the thesis point. But in this case, I also take a stand on the portrait. I say that it's a con position, that the portrait depicts the damage that the environment can wreak on children. Let's take a look at the advanced thesis, and I realize this is going to be a little bit too much, but I just want to give you a sense of what you might be able to do. In this passage from Louise Erdrich's novel The Beet Queen, Erdrich uses binary oppositions, imagery, and point of view in order to demonstrate that although the narrator copes better than her older brother Carl with economic deprivation they faced and the death of their father in childhood, in fact, both are severely damaged and alienated in their own ways. Nevertheless, the text suggests that despite calamities beyond their control, children can best survive traumatic environments by maintaining close bonds with family they have left. So here you can see there are actually almost three parts to my thesis. The techniques, the tactics that I've identified that I'm claiming Erdrich is using for a particular purpose. Then I've thrown in a thesis statement with an although clause that goes against expectations. And I've followed up with a further abstract point, a general point that gestures more broadly to a larger theme. So here's the essay. There are 6 paragraphs, I think. So this is, again, this is an essay that models for you what can be done, but not necessarily what should be done. Your essay is going to be much slimmer, much leaner, and some of your paragraphs may be only half the size, half the length of my paragraphs. So I want you to see what can be done and some things that should be done. But again, the point is there's no way you'll have time enough to flesh out an essay of this length and of this depth. But there are 2 pages, and let's just go through it. In Louise Erdrich's novel The Beet Queen, the merciless year 1929 rocks the narrator's family, not only with the Great Depression, but also with deep personal loss. In this passage, Erdrich uses binary oppositions, imagery, and point of view in order to demonstrate that although the narrator copes with economic deprivation and the death of their father in childhood better than her older brother Carl, in fact both are severely damaged in their own ways. Nevertheless, the text suggests that despite calamities beyond their control, children can best survive traumatic environments by sticking together with what family they have left. The contrast the narrator draws between herself and her brother hint at diametrically opposed methods of coping with childhood traumas. On being separated from Carl while riding a boxcar train, presumably as homeless vagabonds, the narrator remarks that she was afraid, yet surprisingly not because with Carl gone I had no one to protect me, but just the opposite. With no one to protect and look out for, I was weak. As children, it was the older Carl who was fearful and the narrator bold, begging for apples and stealing whey to survive the Great Depression, the winter after my father died. The mother called Carl delicate, but I was the opposite, a word the narrator repeats, presumably to mean here tough. When the rich Mr. Ober visits for a liaison with their mother, Carl hated his visits, but I looked forward to each because my mother always brightened. If Carl withdraws from life into a stuporous dream state, the narrator remains wide awake, withstanding the blows her environment gives her. In fact, she would seem to be a sort of mother figure to the older brother, who, afraid to leave the train, had probably jumped back on the same boxcar and was now hunched in straw, watching out the opened door. The narrator's brave coping response is undoubtedly stronger than Carl's, who is not equipped to confront the travails of life following their father's death. Yet the narrator admits that, paradoxically, she is weak without someone to protect. Carl needs her, but she needs Carl too. In a way, then, her strength is a weakness. The text suggests that both depend on their connection to each other in order to find strength in countering adversities. The loss of their father looms over the passage, but in hidden ways. For example, the mother's necklace of sparkling stones the children know has come from Mr. Ober points up their neediness in contrast to his wealth, but it also strangely recalls the simile the narrator uses on seeing the train pulled like a string of black beads over the horizon, marking Carl disappearing until he is gone. That is to say, the alliteratively matched images of sparkling stones and black beads both mark loss. They are further linked by Mr. Ober's black beard. For the stones are a gift, or more shockingly, payment, from Mr. Ober, not from the father. They are a reminder of his absence. Despite lavishing the narrator with a green satin ribbon for her hair, which pointedly resembles her father's rather than her mother's, Mr. Ober is not there to be a father. This fact is emphasized by the concluding line, "By morning he was gone," a word that echoes Carl's disappearance, but ultimately drives home the original loss of the father. The narrator might put on a tough front, but her need to protect speaks to her own lack of a father's protection as a child. The narrator's first-person point of view further functions to hide her vulnerability behind a tough exterior. The narrator asserts herself in the beginning of the story with repeated "I's," the strange phrase "I ran blind," "I looked up," "I realized," "I saw," "I was afraid," etc., which are followed by actions and states told in a matter-of-fact voice. Indeed, the long and shrill whistle of the train leaving, evocative of a scream, is ironically the most emotive expression in the passage. Even when she states, "I was afraid," or "I was weak," the narrator, the opposite of delicate, mainly just reports what happened or her emotion. An undertone of emotion comes, though, in two contrasting I statements. Remembering her mother brushing her hair, which again she gets from her father, 100 strokes, the narrator states, "I closed my eyes and listened to the numbers." Later, after her mother and Mr. Ober walk upstairs together and close the door, the narrator remarks, "I kept my eyes wide open." The shift from eyes closed to open implies a shift from vulnerability into awareness, but there is a strong suggestion that the girl doesn't fully understand the meaning of the creaks and thumps she hears, whereas the narrator matter-of-factly does. Nevertheless, even later, with eyes open to a world, sadly, wherein people need protecting, the narrator seems, in a broader sense, to be running blind, not fully aware of, or at least not free from, why it is she is weak, without someone to look for. In the middle of the passage, the narrator gives a counterfactual, saying that her story starts then, because before that, and without the year 1929, our family would probably have gone on living comfortably. It's unclear if this means the father wouldn't have died, but the key word here, repeated earlier, and on which the passage ends, is gone, except that in this instance the phrase is gone on. The father was gone from her life. But the point the counterfactual intimates is that children must go on with their lives as best they can following traumas from their environment, whether economic, as in the Great Depression, or deeply personal, with the death of a father. The narrator's strength may be a weakness, but that weakness is in turn a strength, insofar as each sibling's vulnerability is what makes them stronger together. That the narrator is telling her story itself, sad as it is, raises the possibility that she is extending this vulnerability to readers. Okay, so I've decided to add another version of this essay, a more basic version, and I want us to go through it. This essay, I think, is much more doable and gives you an example, a version that is more slimmed down, more is leaner, but still hits all the right notes. So I think you could even cut it down even more, but let's just go through this basic version. In Louise Erdrich's novel The Beet Queen, the merciless year 1929 rocks the narrator's family not only with the Great Depression, but also with deep personal loss. In this passage, Erdrich uses binary oppositions, imagery, and point of view in order to depict the lifelong damage that the environment can inflict on children. Contrasts the narrator draws between herself and her brother hint at diametrically opposed methods of coping with childhood traumas. For example, the narrator is tough in the face of adversity, but Carl shrinks from it. The narrator is afraid when they get separated, but not because with Carl gone I had no one to protect me, but just the opposite. With no one to protect and look out for, I was weak. It was always the older Carl who was fearful, and the narrator bold, begging and stealing to survive during the Great Depression, the winter after my father died. The narrator recounts that the mother called Carl delicate, but I was the opposite. Carl hates Mr. Ober's visits, but I looked forward to each because my mother always brightened. Carl withdraws from life into a stuporous dream state, while the narrator remains wide awake, willing to face whatever the environment gives her. In fact, she would seem to be a sort of mother figure to the older brother, who stays hunched in straw on the train. The narrator's brave coping response is stronger than Carl's, but she admits that paradoxically she is weak without someone to protect. Carl needs her, but she needs Carl too. The text suggests that both depend on their connection to each other in order to find strength in countering adversities. The loss of their father looms over the passage. For example, the necklace of sparkling stones Mr. Ober gives the mother juxtaposes their neediness in contrast to his wealth, but it's also a form of a payment to the mother in exchange for sex. Mr. Ober is not there to be a father to her, note the typo, a fact emphasized by the concluding line, by morning he was gone. The image of the sparkling stones reminds readers of the earlier simile when the narrator sees the train pulled like a string of black beads over the horizon. Carl was gone on the train, just as Mr. Ober was gone by morning. But Carl is the way he is because the father is gone, and Mr. Ober was only there as well because the father is gone. The narrator puts on a tough front, but her need to protect speaks to her own lack of a father's protection as a child. The narrator's first-person point of view further functions to hide her vulnerability behind a tough exterior. She asserts herself in the beginning of the story with repeated I's. For example, I ran blind, I looked up, I realized, I saw, I was afraid, etc. Even when naming negative emotions, the narrator conveys the story in a matter-of-fact, almost flat tone. She says she was shocked not to find Carl behind me, and she narrates in a kind of state of shock. An undertone of emotion comes, though, in two contrasting I statements. Listening to her mother count brushstrokes through her hair, the narrator states, I closed my eyes and listened to the numbers. Closing her eyes in this moment connects to her father, since the mother says she gets her hair from her father. Later, after her mother and Mr. Ober walk upstairs together, the narrator remarks, I kept my eyes wide open. The shift from eyes closed to open implies a shift from ignorance into knowledge. But what's ironic is the girl doesn't understand the meaning of the creaks and thumps, that Mr. Ober is only there for sex. When the narrator says, I ran blind at the beginning of the passage, this suggests even if her eyes are wide open, she doesn't see everything, including how much she has been damaged by the loss of her father and by poverty. The narrator states that without the year 1929, our family would probably have gone on living comfortably. A key word repeated here is gone, but in this case the phrase is gone on, not just gone. The father was gone from her life, but the point the counterfactual makes possible is that children must go on with their lives as best they can following traumas from their environment, whether economic, as in the Great Depression, or deeply personal, with the death of a father. The narrator's strength may be a weakness, but that weakness can be a strength if it brings her together with others. She is her brother's opposite, but they are the same in their loss. That the narrator is telling her story itself can be seen as a form of coping with trauma and deprivation that can never fully be gotten over, even though she keeps going on. Let's just take a quick look back at the introduction and the first body paragraph as well as the conclusion, and notice my annotations here. What I highlight first are the tactics, which again are just observations, but notice how just putting the in order to phrase sets up a claim, because now I'm claiming that these are tactics that are supporting a larger strategy, a larger thesis. And note that my thesis just takes the con position, but in a way is not particularly daring or controversial. I think it's fairly clear that the children have been damaged by their environment, both by the loss of the father and by the poverty from the Great Depression. But that's okay. I've taken a position. It may be straightforward, but it's strong. It demonstrates comprehension of the text, and I do have a claim, both in the con position itself and in the claim that the tactics are supporting my larger position. As for the first body paragraph, notice that I start with a subclaim. I introduce a larger observation about the tactic, the contrasts, and I use an argumentative or an analytical phrase like hint at to set up a larger assertion, to set up a claim. The observation about contrast sets up a claim that goes to some deeper significance. Once I assert the deeper significance, I need to support it with examples. Note that I have quotes here, and some sort of commentary. However, it is the case that my commentary isn't especially fleshed out, but that I sort of interweave some commentary with my quotes that are woven into my sentences. So there's a kind of running analysis staged through this interweaving of quotes. Then I have a short little paragraph that serves as a kind of counterargument. Perhaps it could be stronger, but I do think it gives my argument nuance and depth and complexity. My point is that the narrator's position, her coping strategy, is stronger than Carl's, and the text is conveying or communicating that. But I'm also raising the point that her strategy also masks or just is a response to damage that she has suffered as well. In other words, she may be a better model than Carl, but she has her own shortcomings, her own damage that doesn't totally resolve or overcome the trauma. I won't analyze these final two body paragraphs, but you can take a look and notice that I've followed kind of the same formula. I've introduced subclaims, backed them up with examples, interwoven textual quotes, and included some kind of commentary that support the overall point and explain how my evidence, how my quotes are effective in supporting that subclaim. You might also notice that I'm pursuing a line of argument. Each of my paragraphs, each of my points follows from the other and is logically connected in a chain of reasoning. As for my conclusion, you might have seen that I've introduced new evidence, and that's not always something you need to do. And in fact, you probably shouldn't introduce new evidence in the conclusion, but I think in this case, it cinches my argument together. It helps me get to the so what question, or the, in this case, why does it matter question, where I step back and make broader claims about the consequences of my argument, about the larger significance, the broader significance of my argument, and I also pay some attention to historical context, as I have throughout the essay. So this is just another tactic on my part to achieve the sophistication point. So that's it. We've now gone through the entire prompt and text and produced tactics, strategies. We've turned those into a kind of outline and executed an essay, in fact 2 essays, and I think the second essay is much more doable, but is also quite strong and would receive a maximum score. Now the next step is for you to write the essay, and I will send out this prompt to you as well as the passage, and you can and should use this video and my process to formulate a plan, an outline, and then execute the essay, and I will post a link on Google Classroom for you to turn it in. So I hope that you have done the Middlemarch essay first and then move on to this Beet Queen essay. If not, then I still expect you to do both of the essays. You can do them in whatever order you want, although I think it makes more sense to start with the Middlemarch essay and the video lecture that I gave on that. So for now, goodbye and good luck.